Short their vacation, Speaker Nancy Pelosi called them back to Washington this week to deal with the growing crisis over the Postal Service. Last week, the Postal Service warned 46 states it may not be able to deliver their ballots on time for the November election. Pelosi has accused the Trump appointee who runs the post office of making sweeping new changes that have hurt service. The White House downplayed a report that President Trump wants to meet with Russia's Vladimir Putin in the U.S. before the election. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien says there won't be any summit before the vote, but he said the administration would like Putin to come to the U.S. once there's an agreement on a new nuclear arms deal. For the fifth day in a row, more than 8,000 people died in the U.S. from the coronavirus. Still, the death toll of 1,046 was almost 300 fewer than the previous day. The number of new infections rose by the smallest amount since Tuesday. And another week of chaos for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now the government is facing an exam crisis. The lockdown meant pupils were unable to take their usual exams. The government said instead grades will be based on an algorithm that took into account teachers' predictions and previous scores. But when the grades came out, many students said they were well below expectations. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. I've read 3 articles on the grading thing in the United Kingdom, and I just don't get it. Balance of power. Democratic Representative Ms. Dingell of Michigan. This is an important conversation. Love her. Always very, very candid about this absolutely unique Democratic convention. David Weston leading our coverage. He begins strong with Congresswoman Dingell. Look for that this morning. This is Bloomberg.
That's what adding commodities exposure to your stock and bond portfolio can help provide. The Bloomberg Commodity Index is the standard for commodity market exposure. 23 traded commodities are represented: agriculture, livestock, metals, and energy. The Bloomberg Commodity Index is the benchmark most widely used by investment professionals globally. Track your commodity investments with a proven financial information partner. The Bloomberg Commodity Index. True diversification.
We've put ourselves on the front foot again by adapting all the company, by resizing, by adjusting production rates, by adapting the supply chain as well to this new difficult environment.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Now, EU-UK trade talks start again in Brussels tomorrow, and amid growing optimism about a deal, but the UK's wider Brexit trade strategy also remains hampered. Well, let's get back to Stephanie Kelly of Aberdeen Standard Investments. Stephanie, we talked a little bit before about the US-China relationship. What will the UK-EU relationship look like post-Brexit?
I think realistically, all the signs have pointed to kind of what we've expected all year, which is you end up with a sort of a narrow trade agreement. I think there's a tendency for investors to say, oh, great, a deal, that's great, because we don't want no deal. But actually, the difference between no deal and a kind of a narrow trade deal versus what we currently have, there's chasms between those. I think that's something investors are they need to start to get a grips with more in terms of individual companies, how exposed they are to the barriers that will go up even with this kind of trade deal.
So, I mean, are you suggesting that if we have a trade deal, it would be a bad trade deal, Stephanie, or a very thin trade deal?
I think thin is probably the right description. You know, essentially what I'm talking about is you probably get tariff-free trade in lots of sectors, if not all sectors, which is, you know, really helpful, particularly in some sectors which have potentially kind of 20% tariffs if there was to be no deal on that for that sector. But for some sectors, you know, tariffs would be like 5%. And so there's variation in terms of how impactful that is. But the other side we have to bear in mind is it's not just about what tariff you're paying. It's, do you have to have customs checks on the border? Do you rely on a super efficient supply chain that assumes free movement across borders or relatively free movement? And then how much regulatory requirements do you have to go along with, or how much regulatory uncertainty are you facing? And that will affect the way companies have to invest in the years to come if they don't know what their regulatory environment will be where they produce versus where their consumers are, for example.
Stephanie, what's the urgency of these talks? I mean, from where I sit, it's almost like it's the summer and they're just going through the motions, or am I wrong on that?
Well, I think the challenge you've got is, I mean, initially, right, they said they really needed to get working on a deal before that July deadline to figure out if they needed to have more time. It does take a long time to do negotiations. I mean, if you think the Canadian free trade agreement with the EU took something like 8 or 9 years to negotiate, and that was a trade agreement that both parties wanted, that there was very little. There were political issues, but they were nothing compared to the UK-EU relationship. So I think that's why there's a sense that if you can make progress in the summer, it might seem like, well, there's still, you know, 3-4 months to go. Actually, to implement the free trade agreement before the deadline, there needs to be a little bit of time built in. And most people I've spoken to involved seem to say that they think they need kind of a month or 2 months or 3 months, depending on who you speak to. That's get things implemented in member states, because remember, the EU is not one state, it's many states, and they all have to agree to this trade deal.
What are they arguing about? I mean, give us an example. Give us a tangible trade example that they're arguing about. I don't understand how there can't be free trade across the channel, across the North Sea. So what are they arguing about?
So basically, I think the EU's argument is that the UK is so close to the European market that for the UK to continue to have that really free access, they need to agree to certain kind of what they call level playing field provisions. So, for example, state aid has been one that's come up in negotiations a lot. So if the UK, you know, decided to provide tons and tons of state aid to its companies, right, providing subsidies, providing grants, whatever you want, I think the fear on the EU side is that that will undercut competition with the European partners. And so that's a really tangible example of why they're not easy to gloss over. You do actually have to find compromises and find where the level of state aid that's appropriate is, or what the terms for state aid are. Now, I think the coronavirus complicates that again, because, of course, during coronavirus, lots of European countries have been allowed to do more state aid. So it's going to be around just finding that middle ground. And state aid really is just one of the elements. There's, you know, labor regulations, there's environmental regulations for food and, for example, agricultural products. There are food safety standards. All these things are really nitty-gritty, but they actually really matter to the EU in terms of feeling that they're building a trade deal that doesn't leave them in a worse position than before when the UK was a member of the EU.
Stephanie, what would a Biden administration, or what would the friendship or not look like between the Biden administration and the UK?
It's a kind of an interesting question. I don't think that there's any suggestion that Biden would have any worse necessarily of a relationship. I think the importance of the UK-US strategic relationship wouldn't be under question, but also I think where the difference would be more so on the European side, where we know President Trump has had more problematic relations with European leaders. I'd expect under a Biden administration, as we talked about earlier, that would be a much more positive, constructive relationship, and that the US is keen to see the UK and EU move towards a deal, as opposed to necessarily what we've seen under President Trump.
Stephanie, thank you so much. Stephanie Kelly with Aberdeen Standard, a nice briefing there, particularly on China this morning. Coming up on Bloomberg Surveillance, on our simulcast on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, Michael Shaul, Market Field Asset Management. Really looking forward to talking to Michael of some of the interesting ways to get positioned for the autumn in the markets. Futures up 12. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
It's such an interesting new world.
The world is changing.
For us, it's not about being first. It's about being the best.
While everyone is zigging, we're zagging.
We feel like we can maybe help people out more.
We have an enormous number of big ideas.
I do double down on helping other Black founders, whether it's fundraising, hiring, growth, product, whatever it is that they need.
Give you a sense of the real-time action. The 10-year yield tumbling now 11 basis points, so continuing in this knee-jerk risk-off feel.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta. Let's get your Bloomberg Business Flash. Microsoft reportedly is interested in buying TikTok's operations in the UK. That's according to Fox Business Network. That would mean Microsoft's interested in the music app beyond the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand units already under discussion. Still, it's unclear if TikTok's Chinese parent wants to sell the UK business. There's an indication that the summer slump in the dollar will last longer. For the first time in more than 2 years, hedge funds have turned bearish on the greenback. That's according to data from the CFTC. Falling real yields in the US are hurting the dollar's allure. And oil's up slightly in New York. This week, the OPEC Plus coalition meets to review its supply deal. The group has started to return some crude to the market, with this month following deep reductions. Still, the market faces headwinds, including rising coronavirus infections and worsening relations between the US and China. And that's the Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom, Francine.
Rika, thanks so much. Now, Russia says it's ready to help Belarus in the face of unprecedented protests. Hundreds of thousands of people rallied at the weekend, demonstrating against a disputed election result which saw Alexander Lukashenko return to power. Now, they're now demanding his immediate resignation. In a phone call with the Belarusian leader, President Vladimir Putin offered support to resolve the country's problems. Well, joining us now to discuss all this is Bloomberg's Russia managing editor. She's Tori Clark, and she joins us from Moscow. Tori, always great to speak to you. When you look at how much support Vladimir Putin can give Belarus, first of all, what's at stake for Russia if Mr. Lukashenko actually falls?
Hello. Belarus is, of course, a key geopolitical buffer for Russia. It stands between Russia and 3 NATO countries, and it's one of the last remaining allies that Russia has along the border there. So it's quite an important moment. Now, in terms of what support Russia is willing to give, that's a big question. The Kremlin's statement over the weekend was vague. It's not clear what they can do. Putin confirmed that Russia will provide assistance within their alliances. Now, the alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, has other countries in it, which may have a say in the matter. And the assistance is most likely, they would only really be able to help if there were a foreign incursion to Belarus. So that remains to be seen.
So, what can Mr. Lukashenko do right now? Is he saying, he said actually that he doesn't want to repeat the vote. This is because of a vote that the opposition says was rigged. But can he really hold on to power if the numbers of protests are growing and the number of strikes are growing?
There are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting peacefully now. And workers at some of the biggest state companies are on strike, including the main TV channel. So that's the big question right now. Can Lukashenko hold on to power? He says he will, and he has vowed that there's not going to be a new election.
I look, Tori, at all of this, and I think for so many, and I'll be honest, for most Americans, we need to get out the map. As you correctly say, the adjacency here to NATO, to Lithuania, Latvia, and the like is extraordinary. Tell us the attachment of the people of Belarus west to Poland and east to Moscow and the Russian Republic. What are the people, what's the emotion that they have, as you say, caught in the middle?
Well, for all of these countries, there are historic ties, of course, and they're linguistic, they're familial ties. People have families that, cross all of these borders. So it's a very difficult situation. On the other hand, of course, people in Belarus, like people in Ukraine, they want to have their own independent country. Lukashenko had been for many years, has been balancing the demands of being an independent country and having a massive neighbor right on the border, playing between east and west.
Well, if you look at the Russian highway down to Belarus, and of course, folks, this goes from Moscow down to Minsk, down to Warsaw, over to Warsaw, I should say, and then it bears a little bit right towards Berlin. Fine, that's a lot of World War II history, but is this like Ukraine to the south, where eastern Belarus is hugely dominantly Russian-centric, and western Belarus is much more NATO-centric, and that's the real risk that Putin faces?
Belarus hasn't been quite as divided as Ukraine. That's a different situation. But again, Belarus wants to be its own sovereign country. The people want to remain a sovereign, independent country. Ties with Russia have been strong. Belarus is fairly dependent on Russia economically, but Lukashenko had started to make some overtures to the West.
Tori, what do we know about the opposition leader? So she's currently not in Belarus, but she's urging unity and said she could also take an interim role.
Yes, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is the main opposition challenger. She's in Lithuania right now, fled the country under pressure. She has been saying that she is willing to step in as an interim leader to guide talks and set up new elections. She's called on people throughout the country to maintain peaceful rallies and to hold peaceful strikes. She called very much for order and
Well, Tori, thank you so much. Our bureau chief in Moscow today with some really interesting and the nuanced reporting there on Belarus. Somehow I think we're going to hear much more of this in the coming days as well. Let me do a data check right now. Futures up 10, Dow futures up 71. There's a nice lift to the market even with a VIX 22.49 over the last number of days. I'm going to call it a churn here. Of course, we've seen that small cap and more Dow-centric lift to the market versus tech on fire. Tech, I guess I can say, taking a pause over the last number of days. The yield structure is higher from a 0.12 on the 2-year to the U.S. 0.15%. The 30-year bond nudging right up near 0.70% now with curves steepening. Francine?
Yeah, airlines and travel agencies actually weighing in the stock 600. Again, Spain and Italy just over the weekend telling nightclubs to close. And also France's public health agency warned that the virus indicators are trending upwards, Tom. So you're seeing an impact on euro-dollar, for example, 118.55.
Interesting. I'm watching Turkish lira again. Lira weaker, testing 7.40 this morning. That'll be one of our themes. Jens Nordvig, boy, has he been wonderful at Exante data, particularly on the pandemic. Jens Nordvig, next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This morning, within this unquiet August, stocks, they lift amid higher yields. The euro, it strengthens against all. The Turkish lira, it continues its depreciation. It is a too quiet Milwaukee as the Democrats, well, they convene virtually A CNN poll shows the race narrowing, and voters are, quote, extremely enthusiastic to vote. And Ms. Pelosi, she regrets. In a signed, sealed, and delivered letter, the Speaker demands Congress return to Washington. They will confront President Trump on the United States Postal Service, rain, shine, sleet, whatever that phrase is. Good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance from New York. I'm Tom Keene, Francine Lacroix in London as well. Francine, this postal thing is absolutely, it's uniquely American, what we're going through right now. I'm always dazzled by the British postal system. Is it an equivalent to the U.S. postal system? Like, it's like invisible to me. Who owns the British postal system?
Well, it's interesting, Tom, because we've been through a huge number, of course, of privatizations. Not only the Royal Mail, but you know, Poste Italiane. I remember the IPO as if it was yesterday, but it was a couple of years ago. So it's interesting how different countries. You remember when Japan also IPO'd their post office? It just depends on people, you know, thinking whether it's a public service that that your state needs to do, or whether they're ready to give it to public hands and private hands. Actually, even on the markets.
Just absolutely, you nailed that, Francine. Just absolutely fascinating, country to country, how different it is. I'm always in awe of, I love this, the Royal Mail. Right now, let's get the Royal First Word News. Here's Ritika Gupta.
Morning, Tom, Francine. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has called the House back from vacation to deal with the Postal Service crisis this week. You were just talking about the Postal Service has warned 46 states that it may not be able to deliver their ballots on time for the November election. Pelosi accused President Trump's appointee, who runs the Postal Service, of enacting sweeping new changes that degrade operations. A new poll from CNN shows the presidential race has tightened substantially. The survey shows Joe Biden with only a 50-46 lead over President Trump, and the two are virtually tied in 15 battleground states. Meanwhile, polls from CBS News and NBC News and the Wall Street Journal show Biden with a larger lead. In Japan, the economy shrank in the second quarter by the most on record. GDP declined at an annual rate of 27.8%. The world's third largest economy was already hurting when the coronavirus outbreak hit. Japan had already slipped into recession. In Belarus, it was the biggest anti-government protest yet. Tens of thousands of demonstrators gathered in Minsk to oppose a fraud-tainted presidential election. President Alexander Lukashenko denounced the protesters as rats, trash, and bandits. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Tom, Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities right now. Futures up 11, Dow futures up 76. Look into yield. What you need to know over a week, say, yield structure is a higher yield, slightly steeper yield curve. Critically looking at inflation expectations and the residual of that, the real yield. The real yield is not as awesomely negative as it was, say, 10 days ago. We've seen a nice recovery. The 10-year tips, a negative 0.96%. And Bloomberg Surveillance, we take our yields out to 4 digits. That's the Roman way. That's the way we do it here. Negative 0.96 there. We're watching Turkish lira. We'll talk to Jens Nordvig about that in a bit. Francine?
Tom, European stocks are fluctuating. A reminder, it is August, so there's light trading here in Europe. Investors looking at the U.S.-China trade tensions, also looking at some of the restrictions or countries in Europe being on a quarantine list. Airline and travel agencies weighing on the stock 600. I'm also looking at gold inching above 1,950, but really the story is with crude oil, because we're expecting some OPEC plus news this week. It was up. It's currently now at 41.89, Tom.
Yeah, rounded up, though. Brent crude, $45 a barrel. That still gets my attention, seeing that world price there versus where we were a number of months ago. Jens Nordvig does foreign exchange. He's also written arguably the best book on the struggles of Europe. This is a good number of years ago, but his book on Europe at the time was extremely prescient. He has contributed to this pandemic phenomenally. There's no other way to put it, out on LinkedIn and across Twitter with just acutely sharp data on the pandemic. Jens, you've literally done a public service. I'd be rude if I didn't start with this. Give us a pandemic update. How bad is America doing?
Well, so we come through what I call the second wave, but that's a controversial thing. We've come through a period where there was very rapid craze growth in the U.S. and a number of states, and now that growth is moderating. So we're sort of at a plateau now where we're finding a kind of stability at a high level of cases, but not quite as extreme as we had at the end of June and into July. So it's kind of an interesting situation where globally the U.S. looks like there's not much news. It doesn't mean that it's improving rapidly, but there's just not much news. And then we have some hotspots around the world where France is coming back into the headline, and Spain have been in the headline. So the focus is shifting a bit to Europe. The level is still different, right? Because the level of virus we have in the U.S. is much higher, but the trajectory is going up in Europe. That's the new focus, I would argue.
I can't say enough about what Mr. Nordvig's done, folks, here out on LinkedIn and Twitter on the virus. Okay, Jens, on gold, is it correlated with what? Tell us about gold. Is the back broken on this great gold bull market?
Well, so we've had a situation here where a lot of sort of dollar-linked assets, including anti-dollars, such as gold, had a really remarkable run. And then we've seen essentially gold assume a life of its own over the last couple of weeks. You can argue perhaps there was a catalyst from what you were describing in the intro that U.S. real yields started to retrace a little bit, move slightly higher. But gold's really had a life of its own. So I think it's very much a situation where positioning starts to play a crucial role. If we look at supply and demand in the gold market, it's very, very kind of one-sided what's going on. It's been the speculative ETF demand that has really been driving gold, whereas fundamental demand from jewelry, central banks has not really been that strong. So it's resting on very much the speculative demand, and that is a situation where you're going to have volatility as we've seen, and I think that's going to be the outlook. It's going to be a very volatile asset from here because it's very much driven by the speculative piece.
Jens, good morning from London. So are you saying that gold will basically need more bad news to prosper from here?
Well, it certainly helps gold if interest rates are heading towards zero everywhere. And obviously we had negative real yields very much being priced in the U.S., partly as a function of an anticipation that the Fed is going to move into maybe a yield curve control environment. So that's sort of the domain. I think looking ahead, one of the things we have to look at is the dollar trend really going to continue, right? So that is crucial always to the gold direction as well.
I mean, what's the correlation, if there's any, between gold and Bitcoin? I keep on hearing this. I'm not really sure, what to do with Bitcoin. If it's like does it track gold?
There is some correlation. So I think what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is what you can kind of call portfolio contagion, right? So some of the portfolios that have a lot of focus on gold also have quite a focus on Bitcoin in them, right? So we've seen more correlation there. There's actually more correlation between those two assets than there is between Bitcoin and the dollar. So that's quite interesting.
Jens, I to come over to foreign exchange, and I guess we haven't done it so far this morning, so we're going to let you do it to us. The Turkish lira unravels. Is it discrete and separate? Is it idiosyncratic? Or is it something we're missing here with ghosts back to the 90s, the early 90s, and even the 80s?
Well, so we've been very focused on the Turkish lira really since 2016. It started to look extremely vulnerable. And we've had several kind of phases of currency crisis-like dynamic. And we're entering the last one here in the last few weeks after sort of a mini peg in June and into July. So really what we're watching, and this is what we do for a living, we watch capital movements, we watch all kinds of positioning and balance sheet metrics in the market. And the situation in Turkey is just extraordinary in the sense that you literally have negative currency reserves. So the central bank has sold more currency than it has in terms of foreign currency assets. So they're in a very, very weak position. And the amount of support they provided to the currency over the last couple of months is not sustainable since they have a negative net asset position. So that's the adjustment we're starting to see. As soon as they slow those purchases, they essentially see the lira weakening on a trend basis. And that's exactly what's happening.
I mean,
right now.
On a log basis, it's convex as well, folks. There's some real acceleration here of challenges out 3 and 4 standard deviations, depending how you measure it. Jens Nordvig, do you have a level where this begins to unravel? I mean, can I dare say it's 8, or is it even before that?
I think it's unraveling right now in the sense that they tried to just peg it to establish confidence, and that was not sustainable, and we've seen some meaningful moves over the last few weeks. So the ironic situation with the Turkish lira is that the level of the lira is not a problem in itself. It's not that Turkish exporters are uncompetitive, because the Turkish lira has already weakened 40% over a few years' time. So the issue is that they have very stimulative policies, credit being injected into the economy, pushing the current account deficit wider. So really what's needed is not so much that the currency adjusts to a different level, it is that those fundamental imbalances in economic policy are adjusted, credit policy, monetary policy, and so forth. Until we see that changing, it can go to any level. It will continue to move until those policies are adjusted.
Jens Nordvig with us, and we will continue with Exante this morning. Just to note here, Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Putin in a telephone call moments ago, that out across the Bloomberg. This will be interesting. I'm really looking forward to this. At 9:30 this morning, John Bolton, we interviewed him recently on his interesting and controversial book. We're going to have Ambassador Bolton on. There's a few things to talk about. But all of a sudden, we can speak to Ambassador Bolton about our national security and NATO and Belarus. This is Bloomberg. Stay with us.
We are above forecasts. 1,800,000 jobs is the total non-farm payrolls, with a 17,000 additional jobs added in terms of net revisions.
You still got 1.8 million with a big decline, almost a full percentage point drop in the unemployment rate, which will move to single digits easily in the summer and fall.
Leading up to this data, there was a lot of reason to suggest that the pace of increase had slowed. And in fact, what we see in this data is, of course, it has slowed. But the good news is that it is continuing. And it is continuing despite some slowdowns that we're seeing around the country as a result of an increase in cases.
People tend to focus on the growth rate. The big issue is the depressed level of spending and income in the economy, which is reflected in the level of the unemployment rate of around 10%.
Well, it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
I'm David Weston. Bloomberg Television is reinventing one of the most iconic brands in financial television for a new audience. Join me to see the news program for the clever investor. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, let's get back to Jens Nordvik. He's Exante Data founder and chief executive officer. Jens, we try and figure out maybe when there's some heavy positioning in the market that just doesn't make sense. I don't know whether we talk about bubbles. I don't know whether we just talk about, valuations gone haywire. But is there anything that makes you doubt the true value of what you're looking at in the markets?
So positioning is something that is, let me say, tricky in the sense that it's sort of easy to say, okay, now positions are very big. So for example, right now, there's a huge focus on the overhang of short dollar positioning, right? And if you look at the futures market, it's correct that there's like very large short dollar positions, but it doesn't mean that sort of just predicts that the dollar is going to go the other way. If you statistically test, is it money making to go against, like do a contrarian trade against those positions? It is not profitable, right? So when you look at positioning, you really have to do a modeling where you say, okay, what happens in different scenarios? And in terms of the dollar, we first need to have a catalyst for a turn before those positions really start to be squeezed. So we're not quite there yet. There's a lot of people like getting very concerned about those futures market positions. I'm not that concerned about them. Actually, in our models, we think in a number of crosses, investors will be able to add to those dollar shorts. So that's the kind of sort of nuance that is very important when we think about positioning. But like we've looked this year at what's going on in tech stocks. We've looked up until recently what was going on in gold. So we clearly have some speculative trends that are extremely extended. And I think, to be honest, when you look at the risk that investors are facing, they are fundamental risk, and then there's this just, you can call it positioning risk that is extremely serious in some assets, and it's one of the biggest challenges that investors have this year.
So Jens, if you look at some of the other big challenges, I don't know whether that's something for 2021 or even 2022. What happens to inflation, and how quickly can the picture for inflation actually change?
Yeah, so now you're hitting on the biggest fundamental one. So the point I would make is that right now, actual inflation levels are very low. And clearly, if you look at bond markets, like we have incredibly low yields and we have very flat yield curves as well. So the market is not pricing any major concern. I think the reason you don't want to become too complacent about inflation is the following. The QE we have in 2020 and likely into 2021 and coming years is not the same as the QE you had in 2009 and those years, because at that point in time, it was just a kind of asset swap. You took some bonds out of the market and you injected some central bank liquidity. It was an asset swap. But right now, it is much more coordinated with fiscal policy, right? So you buy the bonds and you give the money to the government balance sheet, and that money is to a much greater degree spent. So the fiscal monetary coordination is much bigger, and therefore the potential for that coordination to be inflationary is there if the sort of policymaker mindset is totally different. And the policymaker mindset is definitely changing. So in a way, it's a matter of the degree to which that really is such a dramatic shift that it's sufficient to cause inflation. And I think mathematically, there is a point where that will be the case. We don't know where it is, but there is such a point. So if the political changes are big enough, it does become a different regime. So that's the new risk.
Really well said, Jens. Are you suggesting then that governments can be successful at reflating economies?
I think we have learned very clearly. We can just look at Japan, right, where they embarked on the biggest QE in history, which was the asset swap type QE. And really, we certainly didn't generate any inflation that was close to their target, right? But if it's coordinated with the fiscal authorities, where we can get that QE mapped into massive fiscal spending, I have no doubt that there is a point where it can generate inflation, and that's the new element. And that's why you don't want to say we can never get inflation, because there is something new about this year's QE relative to the 2009 one.
Jens Nordvik, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it this morning. Jens Nordvik with Exante Data, and again, I can't say enough about his public effort to inform us on pandemic statistics. Coming up on our simulcast next on Bloomberg Radio and Bloomberg Television, Michael Scholl will join us with Market Field Asset Management, their Chief Executive Officer. This is always interesting, whether you agree or disagree with him. Michael Scholl, always thought-provoking in conversation. Futures up 11. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg.
Since COVID ianze hatujakuwa tukienda kazi, so maisha imekuwa ngumu na inazidi kukua ngumu. So swali yenye tunajiuliza, kama hii imefika 1 million plus na situation cases bado zinaendelea kuenda juu, zikifika 5 million tutakuwa aje?
Hizi gari za biashara tumekosa pesa ya kulipa, hata the more inaonekana inaendelea, hata tutabidi turudi ushago juu biashara imeharibika kabisa, hata tujui tutafanya namna gani.
The Boston Symphony Orchestra presents BSO at Home. While you stay inside, enjoy a curated collection of archived concerts and behind-the-scenes stories from BSO musicians. BSO Homeschool provides lessons for music lovers of all ages. New performances and messages from musicians are added regularly. Enjoy these selections and much more at bso.org/at-home. The Boston Symphony Orchestra presents BSO at Home, a collection of concerts, at-home lessons, and behind-the-scenes stories to enjoy while you stay at home. Learn more at bso.org/at-home.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishka Gupta. Let's get your Bloomberg Business Flash. Sanofi has agreed to buy San Francisco-based Principia Biopharma. The all-cash deal is valued at $3.4 billion. That represents a 10% premium over Principia's closing price on Friday. Principia focused on treatments for multiple sclerosis and a range of autoimmune disorders. Goldman Sachs is raising its year-end price target for the S&P 500 by 20%. Strategist David Kostin now sees the benchmark hitting 3,600. The S&P's 51% rally since March has caught many strategists and investors by surprise. And Germany's antitrust regulator reportedly is investigating Amazon. A newspaper report says the Federal Cartel Office wants to determine whether Amazon is abusing its online market dominance to put pricing pressure on sellers. The company says that it has policies to ensure selling partners are pricing their products competitively. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Tom Francine.
Ritika, thanks so much. Equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. The futures up here a little bit, up 10. Dow futures up 58. The VIX 22.53. I want to focus on two things, Francine. The first is that inflation-adjusted statistic, negative 0.96, is a much better, improved real yield from the deeply depressed, massively negative statistic of, say, 10 days ago, and gold has played off that, as some people have mentioned this morning. And the other's Turkish lira, right now at 7.39, watching very carefully. It's amazing, Francine, some of the grimness that we're hearing right now on lira.
Yeah, Tom, overall trading in markets is pretty subdued today. Traders weighing the prospect of European quarantine measures against continued government support. In the backdrop, of course, we have tensions continuing to mount between the U.S. and China. We heard from senior officials from Washington and Beijing late last week postponing the trade talks that had been set for this past weekend to discuss the state of the Phase 1 trade deal signed early in the year. Then we have minutes to be released on Wednesday from the Fed's most recent policy meeting. It may give us clues about whether officials plans to introduce new language in September that may help support dollar, currently at 1.1855 against the euro. You can see a crude oil, American crude, is now down. It was up previously, and then the U.S. 10-year at 0.6931 down.
I'm glad you mentioned the Fed discussion. It's really off the radar. As I get up here, I'll go quickly here, Francine, because I know we've got some wonderful guests coming up here. September 16 is the next meeting, and it's amazing how it's dropped off the radar, and that shouldn't be. It's always important here, again, with futures up 10.
Yeah, so watch out. That is on Wednesday. Coming up, Glenn Hubbard, Columbia Business School Dean Emeritus. Tom, we'll have a good conversation, of course, about yields. Tom, is there anything else you'll ask him? I guess, you know, the trajectory for dollar and dollar dynamics is one of the things that we'll be talking to with Glenn Hubbard. This is Bloomberg.
Some things you see coming, some things you don't. The trick is to be ready for anything. Pablo from Infrastructure Support is working every day to keep essential market data flowing seamlessly. We keep on, so you can keep on.
This is a step in the right direction. Perhaps it's a harbinger for more changes in the future, like the completion of the banking union.
Europe does, as you say, have some catching up to do on that front. So we are expecting to see a little bit of strength coming through at the start of trade. How long will it last, though? The perennial question.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Rishika Gupta. Let's get the Bloomberg First Word News. Members of the House are cutting short their vacations. Speaker Nancy Pelosi called them back to Washington this week to deal with the growing crisis over the Postal Service. Last week, the Postal Service warned 46 states it may not be able to deliver their ballots on time for the November election. Pelosi has accused the Trump appointee who runs a post office of making sweeping new changes that have hurt the service. The White House downplayed a report that President Trump wants to meet with Russia's Vladimir Putin in the U.S. before the election. And National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien says there won't be any summit before the vote, but he said the administration would like Putin to come to the U.S. once there's an agreement on a new nuclear arms deal. One of the worst heat waves in generations is threatening to take down California's power grid. In the past 72 hours, the state has instituted the first rolling blackouts since the 2001 energy crisis. Authorities are trying to protect a system strained by so many people using air conditioners. Temperatures in parts of California may reach 112 degrees this week. Another week of chaos for British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now the government is facing an exam crisis. The lockdown meant pupils were unable to take their usual exams. The government said instead grades would be based on an algorithm that took into account teachers' predictions and previous scores. But when the grades came out, many students said they were well below their expectations. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Rishika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. We could spend all of this interview, this conversation, talking about great inflation and grades as boy has he lived it. He is a former dean of Columbia Business School. His 32 years at Columbia University. We're thrilled that Glenn Hubbard could join us this morning. Glenn, I've got to go to the larger view of supply side economics. You have been the articulate voice of economic growth and linking it into our federal policy, away from the cheerleading that I hear from so many. You have always been a voice of reason and clarity. We are so far from Herb Stein and Robert Mundell. We now have trillions of dollars of pandemic deficit. How can supply side advocate forward given this massive deficit we've earned?
Well, it's a great question, Tom. I do think we need to continue to provide support to the demand side of the economy in the near term. The pandemic is like fighting a war. We've had consequences of a shutdown. But as we look to reforms, this is not the time to think about additional regulation, additional tax burdens on business. We need overall fiscal reform. And unfortunately, I don't hear that conversation in Washington.
Well, we don't have fiscal reform, but if we have a Biden presidency, is it as simplistic as they give back the Trump tax cuts of a few years ago? How should they prosecute a change in tax policy?
Well, I think it depends on the theory of the case. If the theory of the case is we need to, as you were suggesting, address previously built up deficits and debt, then we will have to make tax adjustments, and those will have to include on upper income households. They might include an adjustment in the corporate rate or top rate. But that isn't really what Vice President Biden's proposing. He's proposing new spending. And then I think we have to ask ourselves, what do we do about the existing deficits and debt? So I think there's going to be a big fiscal conversation. I do expect an increase in the corporate tax rate and business tax rates generally. That's hardly pro-business or pro-investment.
I'm placing stop on profit for euro at 118.471. Stop on profit on euro 118.471. Again, it will give us £200 in profit if it will reach this level. So you guys, everybody who knows our strategy, you know how it's been done. So I don't have to explain anything at all. If you have any questions, just let me know.
Hopefully, during the convention this week, that will become more apparent.
Glenn Hubbard, what would you put in you know, the Democrats and the Republicans can't seem to agree and are very far apart on the next phase of this stimulus, right, or on the next stimulus bill. What would you put in it?
Well, we really need this bill to provide support for the economy, and to me, the pieces are pretty simple. One is aid to states, which I know is controversial on the Republican side of the aisle. A $500 billion block grant to states, I and others have suggested. Still think it's the right policy in the pandemic. A second is to continue federal support for unemployment insurance, but at a lower level than before. And in recent work, Jason Furman and Tim Geithner, Melissa Carney, and I suggested a replacement rate formula that would provide extra support, but at a lower cost. And finally, I think we need to continue to look out for small and mid-sized business. That would be the Paycheck Protection Program, but also the Federal Reserve's Main Street Lending Facility. I think we need to do all of those things.
I really want to emphasize here, folks, to see Dean Hubbard working with Dr. Furman of Harvard is extremely important, not only Columbia, Harvard, but also the politics involved there shows the middle ground attempted. Dean Hubbard, I've got to interrupt all that we're doing to talk about the only thing that matters to parents and grandparents across this nation, which is virtual education. You've been in the midst of this with your service to Columbia Business School. Can virtual learning work versus in the classroom?
Well, it can, but I think it depends on the kind of student. So I've taught Columbia students by Zoom before. I'm doing it tonight. I will do it this fall. But I think there's really no substitute for the face-to-face learning. The real pressing question is less what's happening at Columbia and more what's happening to primary and secondary schools around the country. And there we really do need to reopen as quickly as we can, obviously health conditions willing.
I mean, this is incredibly important, Dean. What have you learned about primary and in middle school efficacy of digital learning? Francine and I really don't observe its success.
Well, that's the thing. We observed that many students were not learning as much, and we don't know whether that's the technology, whether it's access differences, whether it's the way teachers conducted the class. But there is a sense of unfairness because many of the students don't have access either to the technology or to extra help to learn in that environment. So we really need to prioritize this for school children and their parents in the workforce.
But that, Mr. Hubbard, goes back to funding, right? The schools, I mean, we're in a different situation as Tom and I speak, you know, almost daily. In the UK, a lot of schools reopened already in June and July. In the US, it's a different case. So does funding need to go to primary schools where it makes a huge difference because you don't want kids that are not educated because they don't have iPads at home?
I think it's an incredibly important point. Part of the reason for a block grant to state and local governments is exactly that. And not just primary and secondary education. A lot of workers need to be retrained in the post-COVID economy. The foot soldiers of that retraining are community colleges and public universities. They need our support. This is not the time to stop that support.
Dean Hubbard, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Dean Emeritus at Columbia Business School and their Professor of Economics, Glenn Hubbard. It's an interesting start to this convention season, except it's really not a convention season, but we're still going to give you the complete coverage, the conversations that provide context to the history being made. On Balance of Power, David Weston in conversation with a gentle lady of Michigan, that key state, Deborah Dingell, Congresswoman of Michigan. Look for that in the 12 o'clock hour. We're going to move forward through this important Monday morning as you reset for the business week and certainly the politics and international relations of the moment. On our simulcast, we've got much more coming up. Futures up 10, Dow Futures up 58. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning.
Position closed on euro at 118,471. We have profit £200